More cube options for SSAS. Up until now, we've covered all sorts of concepts such as creating dimensions and measures and cubes. I've shown you how to create relationships between dimensions. We've created calculated members to have custom columns. And I've also shown you how to create KPIs, those key performance indicators. In this nugget, we're going to talk about more cube options so you fully can harness the power of these cubes. The first thing we'll talk about are drill-through actions. You might want to get more detailed information about what's in a particular cell. So with your drill-through actions, you'll be able to right-click on a cell in your cube browser and then find out the details. I'll also show you how to create translations. With translations, you can specify a target language, such as Spanish or French or German, and then provide captions for all of those different translations. This will be much friendlier for the end user if you're dealing with an international organization. Then I'll show you how to make managing all of those dimensions easier by using perspectives. Think of a perspective as just a collection of dimensions that you want to see, and you're not concerned with a certain subset of your dimensions. So it just makes the layout of your SSAS look a little bit easier to read. Then the last thing we'll discuss are partitions and aggregations. If you have a huge quantity of data and you want to group it together to make it a little more manageable, you can create partitions. In this example, I'll show you how to partition by a date year. And then the other thing we'll talk about is how to configure your aggregations, and then we'll talk about the different storage settings such as MOLAP and ROLAP. Well, let's get started with our drill-through actions. Sometimes you'll want to provide a cube that provides general information about data, and then you want to allow the end user to right-click on one of the cells and then get a drill-down report. Well, the way we do that is through a drill-down action. Let's make some assumptions here. Let's take a look first of all at our dimensions. We want to make sure that we have all the data necessary for our cube. So what we want to make sure that we have in here is, first of all, our reseller. If you double-click on our reseller dimension, we can look at the different attributes in here. Now, I want you to make sure that you have the reseller name and, of course, the reseller key in there. And the other thing I want you to make sure of is if you double-click on product, and we'll look at the dimension structure there, make sure that you have at least the English description, English product name, and let's also throw in the model name. If you double-click on your cube, let's look at our cube structure. I want you to make sure that under measures that you have the sales amount. Okay, so now that you have all that information, let's go ahead and go to our cube browser, and we're just going to look at very basic information. Then I'll show you how to create a drill-through action. So as far as our measures, you just drag the sales amount over there. Under reseller, just drag the reseller name. And there we have all sorts of information. Now what I'd like to be able to do is right-click on any of these items here, and we should see in the menu, after we create our drill-through action, we should see an option to drill down and get more detailed information regarding the products that they're purchasing. So to create this drill-through action, if you look at the tab, it's the 5th tab over. This is for actions. This is where you can create it. Now you'll notice that there are 3 different icons in here. The first one is for just a real basic action. That action might be a URL action or a SQL statement action, and typically that's used in conjunction with client applications. The second item is for a drill-through action. If you hover over that, you should see that. A drill-through action is where you can get detailed information on what you're clicking on. And then the third item here is a reporting action. Now the reporting action, that has more to do with SSAS reporting, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And the basic action, that's a little beyond the scope here. Our focus in this nugget is the drill-through action. So what I'd like you to do is click on this drill-through action, and we're going to give it a meaningful name. For example, we might put in here reseller products details. And as far as the group members here, we want to say fact reseller sales. Now you do have the option of putting in an MDX expression in here to narrow down your results. I'm not going to bother with that here. As far as the drill through columns, this is the detail information that you're going to provide when the user right-clicks on one of those cells. Okay, so we want to provide information about the product. Here's our product, and then if you click here on the return columns, here we have the choices of all of the attributes that are in your dimension. Now, if you don't see the product that you're interested in, what you'll need to do is drill down to your dimensions and add the appropriate attributes. So I'm going to provide the English product name, the model name, and the English description, and then hit OK. So now you'll see that these are a comma-separated list of items. You can add as many dimensions in here as you want, but you can't have duplicate dimensions. For example, we can't have 2 product dimensions in this drop-down. If you scroll down a little bit further, you'll see that we have additional properties. Okay, now default is either true or false. Let's keep that as false. And this has to do with when this is getting invoked from a client application. So that option is really beyond the scope of this nugget. You can specify maximum rows. So let's say that there were 200 products that were ordered by a particular person. You can narrow it down by a particular number, and that's just used for performance. I'm going to keep that blank for right now. And as far as invocation, once again, this has to do with when it is invoked by a client application other than SSAS. We're going to keep this as interactive. You can specify the application, in other words, the client application that's invoking it. Since we're going to be viewing this through a cube browser, we're going to be keeping that blank. You can add an optional description here as well. So I might put in here drill through report for products. This just gives us an indication of what this is regarding. And then, of course, we have the caption, which when we right-click on the cell, it's just a customized caption. So here I might say product drill through. Caption is MDX, true or false. Let's keep that as false. If this caption is an MDX expression, then we would set this to true. Now that we have that, we can go ahead and build this. So deploy actions. And then we'll go to our browser. And I'm just going to right-click on here and clear the results so I can show you exactly what you need to do. So let's go ahead and reconnect here. We're going to drag the sales amount over here and then the reseller name right over here. Okay, so now if I want to drill down and see the products that were ordered for a bike store, I can right-click on here and you'll see that here's our customized caption, product drill through. So I click on that and here's our data. There's the English description right there. Okay, so we've got the product, the model, and an English description. If we wanted to add other information such as the quantity and the price, you can do that. It's not a problem. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this. That pretty much wraps up our drill through action. Now, the next thing I want to show you is how translations work. If you're looking at your cube browser, you'll see up here that we have the default language, which in our case is English. If you click on this drop-down, you'll see that we have a whole slew of different languages to choose from. So we might provide, for example, a Spanish translation. There's actually 2 different places where we define our translations. One is under Dimensions, and the other place is under your cubes. And so the basic process works like this. You provide different translations for your different languages, and then in your browser you choose the language and it's going to provide that translation that you created. Let's double click on our time dimension. You might call yours a date dimension. It depends on how you defined yours. But you'll notice that under my time dimension here, I only have the time key. I'm going to grab some other information in here. For example, I might drag over the English month name, or the English day name of week. You can also rename these if you right-click on here and say rename and just call this month name or simply month. And you can rename this to day of week as well. Just like that. Now, if we go to our Translations tab right over here, you'll see that we have our default language, and then we have our object type, and it just says caption in here, and if you click on it, you're not able to change anything. However, you'll see that there's this little icon up here that says New Translation. So I can click on this, and I'll just scroll down until I find Spanish. I'll choose a particular flavor of Spanish, we'll say Mexico. And then you can provide alternate captions. So if you don't provide an alternate caption, it will just default to whatever the default language is. So in the default language, it says dim time. Of course, we can change this to say like date. And for the Spanish translation, we can say fecha. For the month, we can click on here, and you'll see that we have an optional translated caption. So here, for example, we might type in mes del año. For the translation columns, the reason we're doing Spanish is we actually have some columns that involve Spanish and French in here. Remember, we're dealing with the month, and we have this Spanish month name that we can choose from. As far as the collation designator, we're going to stick with Latin 1 General, but you'll see that there's different collation methods here. Collation has to do with alphabetic ordering. So here, as far as sort order, we can say accent sensitive. Kana sensitive has to do with Japanese and Chinese characters. So we'll just make sure that accent sensitive is checked, and then we hit OK. And you can do the same sort of thing with your day of week if you want to. For example, you can say Spanish day name of week, and then put a translated caption there if you want to. We'll just hit OK right there. At this point, if we build and deploy, and then look at our dimension within the dimension browser, you'll see that one of our options here is the language. If we specify Spanish, Mexico, it's right down here, you'll see that mes del año is one of our options now. And now we have the different months. Now we can do the same sort of thing with our cube. We can double click on here, and you'll see that for our language we can specify Spanish, Mexico. Make sure I hit reconnect here. And you'll see that for the due date, we automatically have this mes del año because we defined that within our dimension. Same thing for your order date. So anything that has to do date will be translated into Spanish. You'll notice also that there's a tab here, the one next to the last tab, for translations. So once again, we can hit this little icon that says New Translation, and we choose Spanish, Mexico. And then we provide whatever captions we want right in here. So here, for the fact reseller sales, we can say ventas del resellers. And make as many translations as you want. So just as a reminder, if you do not provide a custom caption, it will fall back to the default. So let's go ahead and deploy this, and then we'll browse this in our cube browser. We'll hit reconnect, and you'll see here we have ventas del resellers. Now this still says sales amount, and the reason why is in our translations we didn't provide a translation right there. So let's go ahead and provide a translation right there. We'll just put in here cantidad de las ventas del resellers. And then we'll go ahead and deploy this again and view it in our browser. Make sure you hit reconnect. And you'll see here that the caption has changed. Feel free to create as many translations as you want. Just make sure that when you're viewing under the dimension or the cube that you choose the appropriate language in this drop-down menu. Yet another cube option that you can manage is your perspectives. Imagine that you have a lot of dimensions defined within your cube. And you're finding that it's rather difficult to view everything in this default perspective. Really, a perspective is a view of all of your dimensions and measures. In our example here, we have several different dimensions that we're dealing with, but we're only using the reseller and the sales measure up here. So what we can do is create a new perspective that only includes those particular objects. So the way we do that, if you go to the third tab from the right, this is Perspectives, you'll see that we have these different cube objects, and what we're looking at is the default perspective. The default perspective just includes everything, all the dimensions and all of your measures. So what we can do is there's this little icon here that says New Perspective, and let's give this a meaningful name. We'll call this Reseller Sales. And then you pick and choose which objects you want to include in there. I'm going to include the sales amount, and I'm going to exclude the ship date, the due date, the territory, employee, order date, and employee sales territory. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and build this. And then when we view this in our browser, we can define which perspective we want to look at. So here I'm in my browser view. Let's make sure we hit reconnect. In our perspective, we now have reseller sales. So now we're limited to just this view here. It just makes things a lot easier for the end user. I'm also going to change this back to the default language. And you can create as many perspectives as you want here. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is partitioning. Sometimes you're going to have so much information that you actually want to group information, typically by date or by some other categorization. Let's make an assumption here that there were thousands and thousands of records of sales. And what you can do then is you can partition your sales by the order date, or the shipping date, or some other mechanism. So in this example here, we're going to order by date. Now, you'll see that under my dimensions, I have my time dimension. I'm going to double click on this, and I'm just going to explore our data a little bit just so we see what kind of data we're dealing with. So under your data source view, if you right click on here and say explore data, what we'll see here is the time key, which we'll make a note of, and we also have the full date alternate key, which is just in a human readable format. So you'll see that for the full date alternate key, all of these dates are in date order. So we have some dates that are in 2001, and it goes all the way down to 2004. I might want to group my partitions by year, so I would end up with 4 different partitions, 2001 through 2004. So what I'm going to do here is just deal with the first partition. My time key for this first date here is 1, and I'll scroll down until I get to the end of my 2001s right here. So it looks like the time key down here is 184. If I double click on my cube here, I can then click on this tab right here that lets us build and edit partitions. So if I click on there, you'll see that we already have one default partition. I can click on that, and we'll just go, if you don't already have your properties down here, you can always right click on it and click on Properties. And we want to focus on the source. So if we click on here, hit the little ellipsis, the default here, the binding type, is a table binding. We can actually change this to say query binding, and you'll see that there's this query down here that evaluates to the default information. Notice that we have a blank where clause. So this is where we can narrow things down. I want to narrow this down by the order date. if we look at our data source view for the reseller right here, if we narrow down to our fact reseller sales, you'll see that there's an order date key. So we want our where clause to say where order date key between two different keys here. So let's double click on our cube again, go here, make sure we click once again on source, and we're going to change this back to query binding, and we'll say where DBO dot, we'll say here fact reseller sales dot order date key between 1 and 184. And then we can check our syntax by clicking that button, and the syntax was successful. I'll hit OK right there. And then the other thing we want to do is give this partition a more meaningful name. So we'll call this Reseller Sales 2001. And so we'll go ahead and build this. We'll deploy it. And then we want to create another partition for order dates in year 2002. Well, before we create that new partition, we need to find out what the date key is. So you can double click here on dim time, and let's right click on here and we'll explore the data. So we're focusing on year 2002. Let's scroll down here. Looks like we have year 2002 right here. So we're looking at the time key of 185 through, looks like 549. So 185 through 549. Okay, so now let's go to our cube, and then we'll go create a new partition and hit next. We'll stick with the defaults here. It is the fact reseller sales. Find the tables, there it is, and specify a query to restrict the rows. So this should look familiar. So we'll say where DBO dot fact reseller sales dot order date key between 185 and 549. Let's check our syntax. Looks great. Hit OK. We hit next, and we can stick with the defaults here. The processing location is going to be on our current server instance as opposed to a remote place, and our default server location is right here. We can make it somewhere else if we want to. Let's say that we find out that we're running out of space, or we might decide that different partitions should be located in different folders. Let's hit next, and we'll call this Reseller Sales 2002. And we'll design the aggregations for the partition now, and then hit finish. Now in this next wizard, we're going to use the aggregation design wizard. Just hit next. And what we see here are the different cube objects available. And you'll see that we have different categories here. We have default, full, none, and unrestricted. What exactly do these numbers mean? Well, let's take a look here. If you expand these, you'll see that we have the different attributes for these cube objects. So the ship date here has 3 attributes, and here it shows a 3 under default. For the product, we have 8 attributes, and notice here the number 8. This is where we specify which attributes we want to have aggregated. Remember, an aggregation is just a pre-calculation to make performance better. If we're not interested in performing aggregations for color and size, for example, we can just set these to none. Look how my numbers change up here. If I specify full, then it forces them to always be aggregated. If I say none, it's the opposite. And if we say unrestricted, it just means that there are no restrictions on the aggregation, and it still has to be evaluated by the SSAS engine to actually be aggregated on. Now you're probably wondering, why not just aggregate everything? It seems like it would give us great performance for our queries. It sounds great, but remember, every time you perform an aggregation, it's chewing up storage. And if you define a lot of aggregations, creating those aggregations can take quite a long time. So really, you should just aggregate the data that you're really interested in getting pre-calculations on. If the radio button is set to default, then the SSAS engine is going to determine whether or not it should perform an aggregation. So really, setting anything to the non-default just overrides the default behavior. Since I know that our data is pretty small, I'm just going to stick with what we have, and I'll go ahead and hit Next. Now on this next page, you'll see once again that we have our cube objects. If you expand these, you'll see that there's the estimated row count. So if you look, for example, at the sales territory, you'll see that we have 11 sales territories. This is all according to the key. For the dates, you have quite a few. You have the time key, the ship date, the due date. Notice how the numbers there are the same. For the employee, you've got 296 rows. For the reseller, 701, and so on. The whole purpose of this step in the wizard is to allow SSAS to determine about how long the pre-calculations are going to take, and also about how much space it's going to take up. Our next screen will show that information. Okay, so you can hit the Count button right here to have it automatically calculated, or if you want to give your own estimated count, you can override those numbers. I'm going to hit Next. And now it asks us, how are we going to design our aggregations? The default here just says that we're going to design our aggregations until the estimated storage reaches about 100 megabytes. You can override that number if you want to, if you have higher storage. Keep in mind that if you have a lot of aggregations, this might take up a lot of space and it might take a long time. It can sometimes take a couple hours. You can also say, you know what, I'm going to design aggregations until I have X% performance gain. Or the less commonly used option is design aggregations until I click stop. You'll see that here's the start button, so you can start and stop. Or you can say do not design the aggregations. I'm going to do that later. I'm going to stick with the default right here. And now I'll hit start, and this should just take a few seconds because we've got a smaller database. And you'll see how this chart here, this graph, changes a little bit. So it looks like our optimization level is at about 70%, and these aggregations will take up a little over 170 kilobytes. So let's go ahead and click Next. And then we can call this whatever we want to. I'm going to stick with the default name, and now we have two different choices. We can deploy and process now, or we can save these aggregations but don't process them until we configure all of our options. I'm going to say deploy and process now, and then I'll hit finish. Once it's finished, you should see the object list of the partitions. You can also choose the impact analysis button if you want to. I'm going to scroll this up a little bit here, and then you can click on Run, and eventually you'll see the screen that looks like this. By the way, when you're looking at your different partitions, you'll see here on the right-hand side we have storage settings, and you can manipulate any of your storage settings. So you'll see here that we have various standard settings. On the very right-hand side we have MOLAP, which means multi-dimensional online analytic processing. MOLAP is where we're using all these pre-calculated summaries. It does take up more space, but it gives the end users the best query response. And there might be latency in the data. In other words, the end user might not be seeing the most current data. On the other end of the spectrum, we have ROLAP. ROLAP stands for Relational Online Analytic Processing, and that has the least data latency. In other words, it is the most recent data. And the reason why is the data that is getting queried is actually the underlying data view rather than aggregations. So really it's just using indexed views in the underlying database. It saves space, but the performance is not as good as MOLAP. So really the question you need to ask yourself is, how important is it that the end user sees the most current data? Well, that pretty much sums up our storage settings for our partitions. Go ahead and hit cancel, and let's talk about what we learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about drill-through actions. With your drill-through actions, we specified what the detail information was going to be, and we also specified what the drill-through caption was going to be. And so then when you right-click on a cube cell, you can drill through to the details. We created translations for Spanish. Please remember that you create translations not only on the cube level, but also the dimension level, and you can create as many of those translations as you want. If you've got a large number of dimensions and measures that you need to manage and you're only particularly interested in a subset of those, you can create a perspective to just show those that you're interested in. And then the last thing we talked about is creating our partitions. You're going to first of all decide what you're partitioning by, whether it's a date or some other value. And then you also have to specify your aggregation settings. You'll specify which attributes need to be aggregated and which don't. And also, you'll need to specify what setting you're using as far as storage. Remember that MOLAP gets better query response time, but it takes up more space, and it does involve some data latency. And ROLAP involves less latency, but the performance is not nearly as good, and it doesn't take up as much space. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.